Welcome to Indications and Warnings, everyone, with Chuck Pfarrer, co-produced by Alan Brewer. Chuck and I are reporting this show on Friday, October 11, 2024. It is day 961 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. Today, Chuck and I are going to take a pretty wide look at how Ukraine is trying to kill the Russian war machine with 1,000 cuts. Basically, Chuck, when we look at the Ukrainian strategy in the air and on the ground with drones, with HIMARS, with ATACMS, they very, very carefully choose key Russian targets in order to cripple the Russian war machine.
Well, and there are sort of joints and elbows in the body military of Russia. What do I mean by joints and elbows? Petroleum, oil, and lubricants, fuels, and petroleum products that are just as important as fuels, specific lubricants made for specific types of machinery. That goes everything from quite literally axle grease and solid grease that bearings are packed with to extremely refined products that are used in aviation engines. For example, aerospace, lubricants associated with short-range ballistic missiles. You can see that, in any weapon system is made up of hundreds, perhaps even thousands, or even tens of thousands of components. They all have to work. And of those 10,000, let's say 1,000 components in a weapon system, 2 or 3 are always single points of failure. For example, if you don't have solid rocket propellant for your Iskander missile, obviously it's not going to fly. However, if you don't have the oxidizers for your liquid-fueled rockets, if you don't have, you could just go down the list. Any one of those failures is going to take out a weapon system. Ukraine is extraordinary about locating key nodes, key items of logistics, key components where they are manufactured and attacking those targets. And let's face it, Ukraine has an abundance of nothing, right? They have to make every shot count. And by God, they do it most of the time.
They really do. I mean, in a way, you could say that this strategy of inflicting death on Russians, death by 1,000 cuts. Yes, it started on the battlefield, but it really began in earnest with the Ukrainian drone attacks on refineries deep inside Russia. They have struck maybe a dozen refineries at this point in the war. Those refinery attacks have decreased recently, but we know they were effective because Russia ceased the export of certain petroleum products, diesel fuel in particular. They banned the export of. We know that after one successful hit near Moscow, there was a many-mile long line of fuel tanker trucks, obviously unloading whatever fuel was left after that Ukrainian strike, because it was both exposed to another strike and they needed it somewhere, right?
Right. And, there is an example that everyone can get on pretty easily. The majority of military vehicles, they'll tend to burn diesel because it's less explosive, it's less volatile than gasoline. So in the case of that near Moscow refinery, right, there were a couple of barriers to entry, right? So the Ukrainians proved they knew where it was. They proved they could strike it. The people, as the fires burned, the powers that be in Russia realized, well, they've proved they know where this is. They've proved they can hit it. And although they chose to destroy some distilling towers, production capability, there's still a vast storehouse of this perishable commodity. So you could see they did everything they could to evacuate from it. Ukraine has been incredible about, these attacks on these refineries. They're not, we'll get into the area and hit whatever we can. They specifically target the distilling apparatus for specific targets. Diesel's the most easy thing for everyone to understand. Oh, well, they'd want to do diesel because that directly goes into the tanks of tanks and BMPs, et cetera. But just again, some of the more esoteric products are even more important. So you have to give a nod to Ukraine's intelligence and their planning cells. And again, a long-range drone strike, you don't just say, okay, we'll program all these drones and we're going to launch them against the refinery. Within that attack stream, there are diversionary elements. There are electronic warfare elements. The time of day is well chosen. The position of the sun or moon in the sky relative to the target area, that's important as well. Because if you've got a heat-seeking missile and you're trying to lock on a target, if it's coming at you from the rising or setting sun, you're not going to get a lock on it. Seems like little things, but they are meticulously planned down absolutely to that level.
And I'm sure the Ukrainians have a much longer list of targets they wish they could hit. As you say, they have an abundance of nothing, but they are using some of their most advanced drones developed in Ukraine to accomplish these attacks and to succeed, especially those attacks that are taking place hundreds of miles inside Russia. So those are attacks on refineries, but also attacks on hardened ammo depots that I presume the Russians believed were perfectly safe, unreachable by Ukraine, and so hardened that there would be nothing Ukraine could do to destroy them. But Ukraine has proven them wrong.
There's a couple of things that come together. You decide on a location for a critical ammunition storage area. You want it not necessarily, you don't want to do that downtown. So you pick a piece of property out in the country. You build a series of bunkers. You are supposed to calculate how much explosives are in one bunker. If it all goes off, will this communicate the explosion to adjacent bunkers? I mean, this is the civil engineering that goes into planning one of these facilities. You secure the facility with fences and lighted barbed wire and everything else, and you place air defense systems there. What we've discovered is that the Russians are a little slipshod, to say the least, about how they choose to store warheads, solid rocket motors, the fuels for liquid fueled rocket engines, aviation bombs, various types of artillery, ammunition, etc. They're stored willy-nilly. They're not all in the iglooed bunkers. They're not segregated by type. There are a couple of different. If you have a warhead, an artillery shell without its fuse, it's pretty damn hard to set it off, right? You always separate the explosive and the initiators. And easiest way to understand that is, you got a bag of C4 and then you have a blasting cap, and they should not ever be neighbors, because you could take your rifle and shoot 100 rounds into a haversack of C4 and it won't go off. But if that blasting cap goes off, you're going to become the rarest gas in the universe, Chuckinium 165, right? So, but Ukraine has not just located uh, ammunition storage facilities, they've located them by type. What is it they're storing? And face it, Ukraine has to make every shot count. So they're looking for the biggest bang for the buck, and they locate ammunition storage facilities with the least explosion hygiene, where the storage situations are chaotic, where things are piled up next to each other that shouldn't be, things are not adequately dispersed. That's why you get these tremendous explosions that go on all night long. That shouldn't happen at an ammunition storage area. One big boom, yeah, absolutely could happen, but not 20, 30, 40. That tells me you got stuff, they put up these almost like garage roofs, right? And they store stuff under it. That's not safe storage.
This is exactly what happened west of Moscow. And there were a lot of secondary explosions at this ammo dump, which I guess does tell you about the storage hygiene, we could call it, I suppose. They were sloppy. They actually apparently had left a lot of incoming supplies in above ground storage. They weren't stored in the hardened part of that ammo depot. Now, the other thing that the Ukrainians accomplished in that particular strike was in timing. Either just as this train arrived with North Korean ballistic missiles, or just as it was being unloaded. Now, that tells you something about the eyes on the ground that Ukraine seems to have everywhere.
Well, and much of this is overhead imagery. But we talked about this, in previous shows. There's a bunch of factors that come together in targeting, right? There is the geographic element of targeting. What is the 8-digit grid coordinate of this location? Then there is always what is the most important time and location together. They have to merge. And then there are other considerations, including the defensive posture of the target, its liabilities. For example, in a perfect world, the train pulls up with a load of ballistic missiles, and you have all your ducks in a row, and each one of those missiles has to go into an igloo as quickly as possible, right? So that's what I mean. There's a window of time. But you think of this. I can promise you that as those ballistic missiles were loaded on trains in North Korea, they were watched. They were watched for their entire journey into their storage areas in Russia. As that train is en route, you also think of this. The intelligence comes in, it goes to the targeting committee. We talked about just this the other night about briefbacks. The tasking comes down, interdict these munitions trains. It has to go back to the planning cell. They brief back an attack, which is not just, we're going to fire 100 drones at the target. Thank you for playing. You can go back to doing whatever you were doing last week. They're going to say, we've got a multi-pronged attack. It will come, the first drones will proceed from the south. They will be conspicuous. They will urge the Russians to take these drones under fire. The second wave will come in from the west. The sun will be behind them. They will get in. Everything has to be meticulously planned. And they'll say, this is what worked here. It worked again here. It worked again here. So they're reacting quickly to opportunity. They're very opportunistic, and they carry it out well.
And even though Ukraine can now make millions of drones a year inside Ukraine, that doesn't mean that they are making millions of their most advanced and longest range drones. In fact, those particular drones, the kind that would be used, for example, on this attack on the ammo dump west of Moscow, they're not necessarily in immediate supply. They are manufactured in limited numbers. I suppose their availability affects what targets Ukraine is able to choose. Tell us a little bit about some of those most advanced, longest range Ukrainian drones.
Well, there are several turbojet powered varieties. Skyline being one of them, Topaz being another. Very advanced aerodynamic shapes. They will have reverse sloped wings, so the wings aren't sloped backwards; they're sloped forwards. They are made out of low observable materials. You can use, for example, if your fuselage and empennages and everything else is made out of a certain type of fiberglass, it's not a very reflective radar target. They have organic countermeasures units in them. They've got everything from these futuristic flight shapes to the 2/3 scale model of a Cessna, right? High wing, conventional monoplane, 3 landing gear, just about as simple as you can get, but it's capable of flying 600 miles. And it's capable of, there's teleoptical targeting as well, so that it will navigate along the path you dictate, avoiding known air defense envelopes. And as it closes in on its 8-digit grid coordinate with redundant navigational systems, among the last things it does is turn on a camera as it comes in. So a human operator can intervene in the last critical seconds to make sure it's going to hit, where you want it to hit. But here's another interesting thing. If there's a better target that has developed contiguous to the original strike location, you can get it over there as well. So, and looming over all of this is what military historians are going to look at, and futurists in terms of military and even society. This is the first time in history that a combatant is engaged in strategic aviation operations against an adversary using unmanned aerial vehicles. So you think of the 1,000-plane raids against Germany. Well, we're having 100-plane raids against Russian targets with no humans on board the flight. That sounds like a little thing, and maybe we're a bit jaded here in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century, but it's really, really an accomplishment. And Russia's vulnerable, and they're going to be vulnerable everywhere.
Now, wouldn't you think, Chuck, with the air superiority that Russia has, and earlier in the war with drone superiority as well, wouldn't, if you were a Russian strategist, wouldn't you have chosen vitally important war manufacturer sites to hit in Ukraine? But they never do. I have yet to read a report of a Ukrainian drone factory being struck by a Russian weapon.
Yeah, and we may have a perception issue. Ukraine might not report those if they happen, but that would only be a very small part of this. Ukraine has been very good at dispersing its production and storage and manufacturing and assembly of these drones. And everything I just said is a cellular operation. So the design guys work here. The guys making the flight surfaces work here. The guys making the software work here. The guys making the hardware work over here. The guys making the engines work over here. They converge on a number of different sites where they're assembled. Then they go to some place where they're tested, a different place. Then they go to multiple locations where they're stored and communicated to the units that are going to launch them. A lot of Russia still occupied, still operates under the Soviet sort of rules, very centralized command and control. It's going to go to this certain place. And, you know, and Russia is also operating under its own mistakes. Long ago, they turned to the Transportation and Logistics Corps and said, we don't need truck drivers or logisticians. We need riflemen. Give me all your people. Okay, and that's great. And you had tens of thousands of potentially dead people that you could feed into Bakhmut. But now when you look back at your Transportation Corps, you don't have any logisticians. You don't have the kind of people who could administer a dispersed logistical operation. You don't have it. Look, I was a naval officer. I don't know squat about logistics. It's an art form. It's a military occupational specialty. Think about FedEx. I mean, do you think you could run Federal Express so that, you drop it in a mailbox and it gets to Kathmandu tomorrow? That's logistics, right? And Ukraine has that mastered. We're going to get what needs to be at the front, where it needs to go, and we're going to be able to do it overnight. And it takes some brain power to do that, and a compartmentalized organization. Because remember, Ukraine has to operate in a counterintelligence environment, right? There are still hundreds or maybe even thousands of Russian assets, spies, traitors operating in Ukraine. And almost every week, every 2 weeks, we see an SBU arrest of a Russian asset in Ukraine. And that's the unfortunate truth of this war.
There was just one a couple of days ago, as a matter of fact, and it's always the case of an individual in Ukraine, a Russian asset, usually there to serve the purpose of giving Russians the targets that they need, that they want. And that's exactly what this guy was arrested for in Sumy Oblast, which borders Russia. So the other thing that strikes me about this strategy that Ukraine has, this death by 1,000 cuts that they're going to inflict on Russia, they recognize that they can't get to the arteries, so to speak, and have the Russian war machine bleed out. It's going to take months, if not years, to accomplish your objective, to cripple the Russian war machine. But they have slowed it down, don't you think?
Yes, they're definitely having an effect. Of all the war material that Russia is putting into this fight, probably the most significant is simply manpower. And, these meat wave attacks. And again, I always want to correct you. You hear meat wave and you think of a North Korean charge of 1,000 guys. Although we dealt with an attack of 1,000 guys at Kupiansk, we did. And that they were totally defeated, destroyed, killed almost to a man in a battle that took 20 minutes. They were destroyed. So Russia's trump right now, their trump card, is that they can put their hands on huge amounts of human resources. And you'll notice I didn't say soldiers, people, and they throw them into the battlefield. That's their ace. That's their advantage. That ace has an exponent on it, and that is that no Russian commander is ever going to be court-martialed for killing too many of his men. It just isn't going to happen. You're given manpower, and you use it in the greater service of the state. Again, a legacy from Soviet times. There is no individuality. There is no individuation in this society. It doesn't matter. And quite frankly, to a Russian listening guest, if you sign a military contract, there's no way out of that except your death. That's it. You're committing altruistic suicide. You're not just in for the duration, you're in until you're dead. And you're doing it for less than the price of a halfway decent car in the United States. That's it. And it's saddening that there are so many men in Russia that have no other choice for their families except enter into this suicide pact with the Russian forces.
Well, I think that that does tell you something about Russian society. There are only dead ends for ordinary Russians, and there are only dead end alleys if you're a non-Slavic Russian. If you just happen to be a Russian citizen, you are looked down on and demeaned. So you're a buryat from the East. You are the most likely person to be roped into the military and sent to Ukraine. But of course, these military contracts are also presented to people in Russian society who have committed crimes or who have been arrested and face a prison sentence, sometimes for something that's a misdemeanor. This is the incredible thing. Yes, Putin emptied his prisons and sent all those prisoners to Ukraine, but in police stations all around Russia, you are given the choice: sign this contract or go to trial and prison. And it could be for, I'm not saying for jaywalking, but for a kind of misdemeanor or even for suspicion about the legality of your business or something like that. They can be arrested and then given the choice. So many Russians actually take that choice.
I saw a very interesting interview the other day with a Russian citizen, Russian speaking. It was shot in Moscow. And this man said, we still live in a society where, and this comes from Leventi Beria, the most blood-soaked of the KGB heads. This man still said, we live in a country where show me the citizen and I'll show you the crime. And this man also said, if you are involved in a business in Russia, you can always be arrested for fraud. They simply use it. And this man was speaking circumspectly, but very bravely, in my opinion. And during the interview, it finally came out that he had been in prison for 3 years and 8 months already. That's the environment there. And unfortunately, there are another category of Russian volunteers. These are people who are in financial trouble.
Yep.
Facing and the decision is foisted upon them. Look, you want this financial trouble to go away, civil penalties, etc., then you sign this contract. And it's been a tough summer, and the zero line has gone back and forth. But there are things to remember. This invasion started with 400,000 Russians. 400,000 Russians have become casualties in the last 900 days. So that is not man for man, everyone who invaded Ukraine, but it is the functional equivalent of the entire invading force has been destroyed in 900 days. How do you keep that up? And sure, I just said Russia, their ace is that they can get more and more and more people, but it's already having the effect, right? Putin is already on record urging women in Russia to have 9 children. Why is he saying that? Because these are breadwinners in a largely traditional society. These are business owners. These are skilled workers. These are, skilled tradesmen. These are breadwinners, and the embodiment of, and face it, labor. And they're being evaporated in an imperial war of aggression. One other thing, given Russia's gain rate in Ukraine, sure, they've gained in places. It would take them 200 years to reach the Polish border. And utterly, there's no end to this war other than Russia utterly subjugating and occupying the nation of Ukraine. And even then, they'd face a guerrilla war. Is that a win? Anyone out there at the Kremlin, you're looking down. Alan, you and I remember the light at the end of the tunnel in Vietnam. How did that turn out?
Yeah,
it didn't.
It didn't. Of course, manpower is Russia's ace. It reminds us that this is a war between a Goliath, Russia, and a David, Ukraine. But back to the sling that David has, and how Ukraine chooses to use its drones. In addition to targeting refineries inside Russia, targeting ammo dumps wherever they can be found, and we're going to talk about one ammo dump in particular in a bit, but also fuel depots. Now, in Feodosia, which is in Crimea, Ukraine has had a spectacular success striking this fuel depot in Feodosia. It's been burning for 4 days.
Yeah, and Alan, you and I were talking, before the show. There is no Russian Red Adair, is there? There is no master oil field firefighter who's going to come in there. And we see the Russian first responders, they're fighting a petroleum fire with oil. There's a Freudian slip. You're fighting an oil fire with water. You don't do it. And there are, aqueous firefighting foam, AFF. It comes in 50-gallon drums, and you put water into it, and then the water comes out, and it makes firefighting foam. Where is that stuff? Well, I'm sure there were 2, 3, 4, 5, 600, 1,000 barrels of that sitting around behind the firehouse, and it's worth a couple $100 a barrel, maybe $1,000 for a 55-gallon drum. And whoa, it's just not there anymore. And so we've seen that again and again.
They're going to fight that fire with what they have, and that's water. And we've seen the success they've had with it. But I'm also guessing, Chuck, that while the Ukrainians obviously are cheering, this strike on Feodosia succeeded probably beyond their expectations.
Yeah, there's another thing that goes on, and these are very obvious, and most people see it, but it's good to underline it. You've got a fire at this Theodosia plant, right? It's burning. The firefighters are ineffective. The blaze is continuing to burn. In the meantime, everything at that plant, every other storage plate, every other tank, all of the other equipment associated with that plant, it's out of action. Right? They're fighting a fire in 1/3 of the thing, but everything's taken off the table right now. And as we saw at the POL facility near Rostov-on-Don, which was part of the Russian Strategic Petroleum Reserve, that thing burned for, what was it, 2 weeks? There were 72 storage facilities, and 68 of them burned down. I'm just going to go out on a limb. I think we'll be talking about Theodosia next week as well.
It's quite possible. It's not as big as the facility at Rostov-on-Don, but it's big enough to burn for probably a few more days, I guess.
And we look where it was, and you can you can see how far that drones had to go to address that target. It's a long way. What a strike.
Yeah. And it's part also of the success that Ukraine has had in crippling the Black Sea fleet in particular. So I don't think that Sevastopol is any longer of service to the Black Sea fleet in a significant way, right?
Yeah, it's these are the deaths of 1,000 cuts, and you and I say often it's not the Crimean Peninsula; it's the island of Crimea. So Ukraine has hit POL facilities on both sides of the Kerch Straits. They've also interdicted the principal means by which petroleum products can cross the Kerch Straits, which it's still, but operating under very reduced traffic restrictions, are the railroad tracks on the Kerch Straits Bridge itself, because that rail link it's not back up to snuff. They've sunk every single one of the rail barge vessels that communicated across the straits. They're all sunk. One of them is sunk right in the channel. So it is just sunk. It's plugging up everything else. And now they're hitting the actual product itself. There are a number of naval aviation bases on Crimea. There are still a number of naval facilities. And again, we talked about, you hit the elbows and joints, right? You can have a lot of corvettes in your at pierside, but if they don't have the diesel to run them, what have you got? And it can be really key. I mean, these ships, I think there were 1, 2, 3, 4 left. They don't have the fuel it's going to take to operate. They don't even have the fuel it takes to get to safety.
Exactly.
How?
Yeah, you can't hide in the middle of the Black Sea, can you? If that's where you run out of fuel. And Sevastopol, of course, was also the site of one of the most memorable Ukrainian strikes on command, killing the admiral of the Black Sea Fleet while in his corner office. I mean, I know we're reaching back now into storied history, but this is also part of Ukraine's strategy, death by 1,000 cuts. You take out commanders now, starting with this admiral. That was pretty spectacular when they did that.
Yeah, look, nodes of command and control and high value targets, personnel targets, those are righteous military targets, right? Admiral Yamamoto was shot down in the Pacific. That's a legit target. You imagine if the Japanese came after Admiral Nimitz, hey, he's a legit target too. In this case, it shows the elegance of Ukrainian intelligence. Not only did they know where the conference room was, on what floor, in what part of the building, in which way the window was facing, but they knew, again, temporal inputs on the geographic target. They knew when the conference was and when it would be in progress, and they hit it with a drone. Wow. Wow. Try to imagine for a second being on the other side of that. Try to imagine that you have a command meeting and it gets hit with a HIMARS, it gets hits with a drone. You are going to be cast into that wilderness of mirrors. Where's the leak? How did they get this? Was it signals intelligence? Was it a human intelligence exploitation? Was it, signals traffic analysis? Was it electronic emissions? How did they determine this target, and how were they able to prosecute it? Don't forget. I mean, we say, "Well, that was a great hit," and we move on. Don't forget the diversion of manpower and intellectual capability it takes. Somebody had to pull all the threads out of that target and say, "How did this happen?" We have to know. And also think of this, what air defense doing, right? How did that drone get in here? Was it a long range drone? Was it a short range drone? Was it launched downtown? Hey, jury's out. And that's good. You divert those resources. And you also look, nobody wants to die, and especially corrupt Russian generals. I mean, hey, they got dakas in the Black Sea and Swedish girlfriends. They want to live like the millionaires they are. And you put the fear of God into these guys. We're coming after you. You're the target. That's great. Think of the diversion of resources to their personal security, right? How that interferes with their job. They don't give a lot of speeches to the troops, do they? All of the things that affect how an admiral or a general needs to function.
Well, there was that Russian colonel, I believe, in Donetsk, who was intending to give a speech to his troops. He was running late. Who knows what he was doing? I don't know. But he kept a few hundred Russian soldiers waiting at parade rest, when you come right down to it. And they waited just long enough to be spotted by a Ukrainian drone and hit with HIMARS, I believe. So that Russian colonel never got to deliver his speech because there was no one left to hear it.
And there is a bit of military courtesy involved, right? The troops have been assembled. The general, colonel is supposed to be here. Look, we get that. But if the guy's going to be 45 minutes late, it does not take very much for the formation commander to say, fall out at ease, right? Or even maybe a more prescient commander to say, all right, you knuckleheads, fall out and scatter, but listen for my whistle and come back out of the trees when I call you, because we're within HIMARS range. There are no Russian officers like that. They don't have the common consideration for the guys, and they don't have the sense God gave a goose. Major formation, right, within HIMARS range.
Well, they seem to have such hubris that they feel safe in the rear, even though Ukraine proves to them again and again, there's nothing safe about where you are, and we're going to prove that to you. So again, this strategy. Take a look at the ammo depots closer to the zero line. Apparently not very well concealed by the Russians. Just outside Bryansk, the Ukrainians struck a Russian ammo depot, again with spectacular success. And from what I've read, Chuck, this would have been the ammo funneled into the Russian troops trying to sweep the Ukrainians out of Kursk. How did the Ukrainians spot this particular depot?
Well, again, the Russians are sloppy in the way they store their munitions. The munitions are not segregated properly. I'll get into that in a minute. They don't take the fundamental basic steps of camouflage. They don't. You can imagine that site was probably located because a 10-kilometer long convoy pulled in there last Wednesday, right? And again, they don't have the brains to say, okay, you two trucks get there at 11 o'clock. You two guys get there at 2 o'clock. You see, they don't have that. They can't count on any of the trucks getting there because nobody knows how to read a map, right? And they don't even mark the route. It's just, okay, so we've got all that. So they're storing all this ammunition together. there's one kind of round that gets stored that is really makes a sympathetic target, and that's a mortar round. So that's kind of a teardrop shaped thing with a big long fin off it. At the bottom of the fin are these C-shaped bags of propellant. They're called increments. And each mortar shell comes with about 5 of them. And when you want to go the longest range, you leave all 5 on and you drop it in the tube and it flies up. And if you're shooting at a shorter range, you take 2 or 3 of those increments off. And if you are a trained soldier, you throw those into a 3-foot deep hole that you've dug away from your mortar position. So they are extremely flammable. If you touch a match to it, it doesn't explode, but it burns furiously. Okay, if you just got 150 crates of mortar rounds of all sizes, from 60 millimeter to 100 millimeter to 200 millimeter, with each of those increments getting bigger and bigger and bigger, you hit that and it burns and it goes off and that it explodes. And that explosion goes over to 10 feet away where you stored all the artillery fuses and they go off. And then they set off the 500-pound bombs that you put over there. So there are sympathetic detonations that happen. And that is the term of art in demolitions, a sympathetic detonation. And that makes for, we call in the SEALs, a sympathetic target, meaning you hit it once and it'll eat itself to pieces. And you can tell because you watch these explosions, they continue, things are blowing up in the air, things fly up in the air, trailing smoke. It's a rocket that was set off. It's nuts. It's nuts. But again, you know, what they did to the Transportation Corps, they did to the Ordnance Corps. That is another military occupational specialty. Those are the guys that know, here's how you set up an ammunition dump. We don't care. We don't need ordnance guys. We need riflemen. Mm-hmm. So you've got 2 guys in a truck moving your ammunition for you. And that isn't going to change, Alan. They are not going to pull their thumb out and get their ducks on line about their logistics, about their ammunition storage. It isn't going to happen. These are this is devolution, right? They are just going downward. You can't arrest that and go back up. That's a decades-long process.
And best done after losing an imperial war like this.
From your lips, God's ears, yes.
You know, when we think about the targets that Ukraine has chosen to hit, I also think, what targets could they choose to hit if they simply were delivered long-range weapons and given the freedom to use them as they see fit? They have ATACMS. ATACMS are restricted. There are other long-range weapons that the United States could supply. Of course, Germany could also send the Taurus cruise missile. They have not done that. But prior to the Ramstein meeting, which was unfortunately postponed, General Christopher Cavoli, who's the supreme commander in Europe, American general, talked about a list of weapons in his mind that Ukraine really needs. What are some of the weapons that Cavoli put on this list, and how would they help Ukraine shorten this war that they are winning?
Yeah, we tried to find the list. We determined that, and this is interesting because there's some military terminology of art here that shows why we couldn't find the list of weapons that General Cavoli wants to make available to Ukraine, because it also included the list of weapons and capabilities to be supplied to Ukraine. So a weapon is a capability, but a capability is also electronic warfare, electronic countermeasures, means and mechanisms of reconnaissance. one of the things mentioned was the Link 17 communication system, which allows literally your rifleman to communicate to his superiors and them to the artillery and them to the maneuver elements, and a communications modality. It's cellular structure, not cellular phones, but cellular in structure, so that battlefield commanders can reach down and play the concert organ that is their maneuver, or they could play the whole thing. It's interesting to me and poignant at this point. I don't think the United States is, in the foreseeable future, going to give Ukraine the kind of weapons that can strike distant Russian oil refineries, for example, distant Russian airfields. I frankly don't see that in the cards. And that is why we have Ukraine carrying out those missions with indigenously produced long-range precision strike UCAVs, right? Drones. And, so why do I say that? Well, some of these targets have been 1,000 miles into Russia, 600 miles into Russia. There are numerous Russian, American missiles that can hit and prosecute those kind of targets, but they'll never be given to Ukraine. Ukraine is hitting those targets on its own. Again, poignant because they have to, but look what they've done. They are prosecuting those targets, and it is having an effect on Russia's war machine. But so what are some weapons that General Cavoli would see here? General Cavoli is approaching that problem. What do we give Ukraine? He is a West Point trained officer. He's been in the military 30 odd years. He's in a very high position. He's there not because he is a grifter and a millionaire who's enriched himself on the goodies of the American military, but because he is the best commander for the job, right? He's going to approach this problem. What does Ukraine need? He is going to say, what would the United States Army need to conduct successful maneuver operations in Ukraine? Well, they need air superiority, right? They need the kind of fighter planes that can shoot down anything that flies over the battlefield. Is Ukraine going to get that? No. Will they have it in the next 10 years? No. Okay, let's all take a nice breath and don't forget that. In lieu or in support of that, what's the next best thing? They need air defense superiority. If they can't shoot them down with Snoopy and the Red Baron, Goose and Maverick, they need to have adequate surface-to-air missile coverage. So if it flies, it dies. Do they have that? No. Could they get it? Yes. Will we give it to them? I don't know, Alan.
Yeah,
I don't know.
know either. And I think this really is it's the tragedy of this war, that the United States in particular has so many weapons, so much equipment in storage, quite frankly, that it could deliver to Ukraine, and it hasn't in 960 days now. And this is also the unfortunate thing of this particular Ramstein meeting being canceled because of natural disasters in the United States. So Joe Biden canceled his trip to Ramstein. Other state leaders also were going to be present, but the meeting didn't occur. It will supposedly be rescheduled, but it probably won't be rescheduled before the American election in November. And so that will color the next Ramstein in ways that we can't predict.
And so we've gone from air superiority. What's going to happen with that? We've gone from air defense, and these are pretty much ranked in order of importance as far as I'm concerned. What's the next thing Ukraine needs? Well, artillery is the king of battle, right? Artillery is what you use to break up enemy force concentrations before they can get to you on the zero line. You use it to diminish and attrite your opponent's defensive positions when you wish to attack. Attackums, as much as the Russians have managed to charge that and make it a dirty word and a red line, the Attack'em systems is an artillery system. It is a short-range ballistic missile, but it's artillery. You can't hit Moscow with an Attack'ems, right? It's a tactical weapon for use on the battlefield. Ukraine needs more Attack'ems. It needs more HIMARS, which are a multiple launch rocket system that is guided. They need more dual purpose improved conventional munitions. Those are cluster bombs. It's fascinating. Russia saying cluster bombs are prohibited, but they know a lot about cluster bombs because they deploy them against train stations full of refugees.
Right.
Yeah. So Ukraine cannot win this war without at least artillery parity, right? In terms, they'll never come to grips with Russia's volume of fire. Russia always sends more outgoing than Ukraine can. But Ukraine can make up for that deficiency by elegance of targeting, right? The Russians will send, when you launch a bunch of Grad rockets at a target, it's an area weapon. And you see places on the battlefield where every 20 yards there's a crater. That's a Grad missile strike. If they hit you, it's kind of an act of God, right? But with a HIMARS strike, yeah, if they hit you, it's because Raytheon did its job. So, okay, so beyond artillery, they also need tanks, they need Bradleys, they need mobility assets to move their troops around. They need everything. And I'll just wind this up by saying, look, General Cavoli knows exactly what Ukraine needs. Every member on his staff knows. What would we need to win this war? It's simple. But generals don't make the decisions in the United States. They never will. It's a political decision. And, civilians make policy. The military executes policy.
And this is why that next Ramstein meeting was going to be so important, because it was the political leaders who all would have been in attendance. And frankly, some of them would have been able, I think, to pressure Biden and pressure Schultz to reach some kind of agreement with plenty of support from these other leaders of nations who are allies of Ukraine. In other words, the United States and Germany are not going to be out there all alone. They have the protection, so to speak, of France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Italy, even Turkey, all saying that we are in this in the fullest possible way for Ukraine. You have something to give that we can't give, and we think it's about time you do that. I'm pretty sure the discussion would have been that honest at Ramstein.
Yeah, I think so. And perhaps the meeting should have been postponed, right? The emergency management function of the hurricanes is now, the executive portion of the emergency management is done.
Mm-hmm.
FEMA should be executing on orders. It should have been postponed.
Mm-hmm.
But you and I have also been talking about this. I don't think anything substantive is going to happen until February, March, April, perhaps. It's completely disheartening.
It is disheartening, and that's simply because of the schedule of American politics. When a new administration takes office, not much gets done, except putting that administration together, appointing new members of the cabinet, having them confirmed by Congress, etc. So we could well be looking at another 5 months of American indecision and quite possibly an interruption of needed supplies to Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's true. And remember, whatever is sent to Ukraine now, at least half of it has to be squirreled away, right? If they got, say, 100 Bradleys, at least 50 of those would have to go into strategic reserve, maybe 60, because Ukraine has to act like Mike Johnson could strike again. They have to act like they may never get anything else from the United States. And I'd appreciate a clear policy statement from Washington. If you're going to abandon Ukraine, have the courage to say it. Don't tell the soldiers on the zero line you're on their side. You'll never forget them. Don't embarrass yourself with words like that. You're not following through on it. You know what it's going to take to win this war. You also know what it's going to take to make this neighborhood of the world safe again. And that is, let's just put it bluntly, it's the defeat of Russia. A defeat. That's what it's going to take. And you're not just fighting for Ukraine. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Romania, the security of those nations, full NATO partners, is predicated upon the security of Ukraine. And let's face it, taking the hatchet out of the hand of Vladimir Putin.
Absolutely.
So, you either get rid of Vladimir Putin or make sure his hatchet doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
Either one of those.
Well, Ukraine is taking care of the hatchet, and you know, mortality will take care of Putin, I guess. The man just had his 70th birthday, 71st birthday. He's not going to live forever. He's already exceeded the expected lifespan of a Russian man in Russia today. But, one thing that really concerns me about this time of year, just the change in administration that will occur in the United States and the postponement of the Ramstein meeting. And if you're right, Chuck, nothing happens until next April, or maybe we get lucky next March or something like that. That's right before the summer campaign season. It means that Ukraine may not have what it needs to go on the offensive next summer. They will face another summer of holding in a defensive posture, and that has got to be taking a terrible toll.
It is. That the United States is inadvertently, and I might say negligently, establishing the pace of battle. Right? There are no weapon systems that in and of themselves, are war winners, including the F-16. It takes decades to build an air force. Look at every nation that enjoys air superiority. Almost every one of them has had military aviation in their arsenal since World War I. Name a country that did not participate in World War I that has complete sovereignty of its skies. I can't think of one. Can you?
No.
No. Okay, so that's what it takes to get an air force going. It's a capability as complex and labor and capital intensive as having a blue water navy. That's how important it is, and the exception proves the rule. China enjoys, relative impunity from air attack, but look at the trillions of dollars they have placed into, formating an air force. And they still lack that certain human factor that comes from 100 years of military aviation, the institutional and intellectual understanding of air war. That's why there is an Air Force War College, right? That's why the Air Force calls things air battles.
Mm-hmm.
When you've got an AWACS up and 100 planes in the air, it's a battle. And there is another key Russian vulnerability. They only have 5 or 6 A-50 AWACS planes in existence. That's a vulnerability for them. That means they're operating their airstrikes, which are numerous, but they're doing it on onesies and twosies.
Mm-hmm.
It would be very hard for Russia to organize, for example, a fighter sweep over Ukraine.
Something I'm surprised I haven't seen them do, actually. I mean, over a year ago, I asked Latin, I asked Top C, I asked you, where is the Russian Air Force? It doesn't really seem to be in the battle in a way you might expect to see it. And it's being preserved, frankly, by Russian commanders. It seems to me it's such a vital component of their military. They are not really putting it at risk.
Yeah, and we should get Hopsy and Latin on the show because those guys are our go-to military aviation experts. My understanding of air power, I always say this, was as a consumer, right? When I wanted air power, I got on the radio and they delivered it like a pizza. So I'm not the guy to speak so much, but we have the experts who can. So
yeah, and they will join us, I'm sure, in the future. So in a way, I think one of the points that has come out of this conversation, Chuck, the strategy of inflicting 1,000 cuts on Russia, trying to cripple the Russian war machine in that way, has essentially been forced on Ukraine. It's not a strategy that they might otherwise have chosen if they had received the full support of the United States in a timely way.
Well, they're always going to have to do this because this always was and will remain an asymmetrical fight, right? So this is David versus Goliath. And we've seen different phases of the war where Ukraine, thank God, and not thank God, thanks to their intellectual capital in their military, when Russia was invading with division-sized forces, Ukraine did not engage them 1v1 in battles. They resorted to attacking ground lines of communication and supply. They've never lost the idea that asymmetrical means are the only ones that are available to them. Their air force is vastly insufficient and inferior. They don't have artillery parity. They don't have complete control of their skies. So this is why we see someone like General Budanov becoming so much more important, because he controls one of the best asymmetrical tools that Ukraine has. Special operations forces, leave behind forces, the intelligence apparatus, naval special warfare capabilities, including remotely operated surface vessels, his robust force of naval special warfare operators, SOF guys on the ground. It's always going to be an asymmetrical fight. So Ukraine has been really good about fighting smarter and not necessarily harder. But Russia's got to be defeated. That's the only beneficial outcome of this war. It just has to happen.
It does have to happen, and I think it will happen. But as you say, Chuck, it's going to be a long war. The United States is actually lengthening the war because of some of its decisions and some of its refusal to make decisions.
That in itself, there is negligence by omission. There is. There's that negative, inaction is just as negligent as wrong decisions. It isn't. I wish you and I had not been covering this same ground for the last 3 years, but we have been.
Yes, we have had this same conversation. It's unfortunate, but to all of our viewers, and maybe you are new viewers, that should make a difference to you, hearing this conversation and thinking this is the first time Chuck and I have talked about this. No, it's about the 10th time in the last 900 days that we've talked about it. What are we going to talk about on indications and warnings as the information warfare initiative gets going? We'll probably talk about our schedule and topics on the next show. We have to do a little bit of work to see who might be available to join us, to see what is happening on the Zero Line. I'm pretty sure next week we will have maps to walk through, likely maps in Kursk, for example, but elsewhere on the Zero Line as well. So I encourage all of the viewers with us to subscribe to Information Warfare Initiative. Get notified when Chuck and I will be doing a program. Get notified when new programs are added to this channel. And participate by leaving your questions in comments. That would be the most helpful thing for Chuck and me, I think.
Yes, and we are finding our way. As everyone knows, Alan and I have been working together on the radio for years now. We are finding our way through YouTube, and we also appreciate suggestions. If you've got an idea for us, if there's something that we could actuate for you, look, we're happy to do it. I never thought I'd be saying this, but push the like button. That's free. Subscribe. Push the notification button. It helps. It helps the algorithm. We're getting about 1,000 people. That's great. We are not in it. Look, we're not in it for clicks, right? We both have faces for radio. We're in the information warfare fight, right? We want to help you dominate in your information war microcosm. That's why we do it. Dinner party, pub, conversation, cocktail party, someone's telling you that we should give up, Ukraine is losing. Well, stick with us.
Yeah,
we'll give you some of the bullets you need.
Thanksgiving is coming up, Chuck. I think we could start any number of family fights, but it will be our viewers who win.
And I always say Thanksgiving is the rehearsal for the full-scale psychosis of Christmas.
There you go. Well, thank you again for joining me on Indications and Warnings. As I always tell people, this to me is the experience of my lifetime to co-produce a show with you, Indications and Warnings, here on the Information Warfare Initiative. With that, let me say, as I say every single day, Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava. Let's in it to win it, folks. And we'll see you real soon on the next Indications and Warnings.
Goodbye, Chuck. Thanks.